we're live. Awesome. Hey, everyone. So we're here today with Meltem, and we're going to talk about on-chain governance and its tendency to trend towards oligopolies and what we can do to prevent that, or what is the whole premise around on-chain governance. I think overall, on-chain governance is just such a messy topic, and everyone seems to have different opinions about it. And different viewpoints on whether it even works, whether it's even worth trying. And some people feel, on the other end, some people feel this is like the ultimate solution to governance. And I think there's really a spectrum of different views, and we really want to dive into each of these and talk about the merit behind each of them, and maybe even plug in some data if there's any.
So data. This is the amazing thing. Like, we have information we can look at that will help us form a more informed, fact-driven opinion. So I'm excited about that.
Awesome. So Meltem, why don't you give a kick? So you wrote a post called like Politics, Power, and Protocols, where you kind of dove into the current state of on-chain governance. And one of the main claims you made in that blog post was that the current mechanisms are trending towards oligopolies.
Yeah.
And before we even dive into that, I think it's important to kind of set the context and definition so that everyone's on the same page. And so could you just give a quick overview of, from your point of view, what do you believe governance is, and what does it mean to have on-chain governance?
Sure. So governance can mean a lot of different things. What I outlined in the post is governance really is about the rules, how rules get made, and how people operate within a system. And historically, governance has sort of been thought of as politics. I talk quite a bit about, the Romans and the Grecians figured it out a long time ago before us. And there's a great philosopher and political theorist named Polybius who came up with this idea of the political cycle and how humans tend to organize in different structures and what the relationship is between oligopolies, tyranny, democracy, ochlocracy, plutarchies, etc. So that was sort of the starting point. Most people think about governance as politics. And what's interesting about governance is there are two sort of forms of governance. There are explicit forms of governance. So in the US, for example, we have a governance system. We have a representative democracy. And so there are a lot of different structures associated with that. There are checks and balances between the three branches of the government that rule how this country works. And so those are formal, sort of specified governance mechanisms. And then the other aspect of governance is informal. And so informal governance is really about exercising soft forms of power, control, and influence. So that's about the media, that's about campaigning, that's about backdoor deals or behind the scenes deals that may happen, some of the power brokering and gerrymandering that goes on. And so as we think about blockchain systems and blockchain networks, the way I think about it is there's the protocol, which is sort of the rules language, how the system functions. It's also the level at which the tokens are allocated and sort of managed. Then there's the network itself, which is how this code gets deployed in physical space and time, right? And so with a lot of these new governance mechanisms, there's actually a layer above the network layer where there's a formal on-chain governance mechanism.
Yeah.
And then Bitcoin, for example, has an off-chain informal governance mechanism. Ethereum has an off-chain, somewhat more formalized governance mechanism because there is an Ethereum Foundation that is a formal body that is tasked with sort of providing support to and helping develop the protocol. And then there are new projects that now for the first time are alive. They've been talked about the last few years in the world of crypto, but had not really been implemented at scale until we saw the emergence of Tezos. Now we have Cosmos launching, which is a staking protocol. And oops, sorry.
It's okay.
My phone. And so there are all these different protocols emerging that are expressing governance. And we now have actual data points around the voting outcomes in some of these protocols. And that's become really interesting because for the first time we can observe how formal governance is trending, how informal governance is trending, and whether on-chain and off-chain really have substantial differences. The big thing I will say about on-chain that makes the stakes, not to make a bad pun, that makes the stakes higher is in on-chain governance, when a decision is made, it gets implemented into the protocol.
Yeah.
That's, for example, if a decision gets made in Congress, it gets implemented into the rules that govern the US. But if something is discussed, like AOC discussing the new Green Deal, that is not formal governance, right? Those are informal conversations, so that's not implemented. And so when we talk about people participating in formal on-chain governance, the implications are really big because these changes are actually getting merged into the protocol in real time. So,
yeah. And so kind of setting the context, what do you think so on-chain governance seems to be the approach that a lot of these early protocols have at least tried to take. And what do you think is the narrative around the problem that they're really trying to tackle with on-chain governance? Why do you think that was necessary, and why do you think they didn't just go with off-chain governance like Bitcoin?
Sure. So one of the comments I made that I think is probably a bit, I don't know, maybe a little controversial, is I think a lot of these protocols were formed with these new types of governance as sort of a direct response to the perceived tyranny of Bitcoin. Okay. And so do you agree with that statement, I guess, to start with?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear a little bit more before I agree.
Sure. So I think a lot of people, Bitcoin really, for a long time was the cryptocurrency. Vitalik was inspired to create Ethereum because of a lack of functionality in Bitcoin. I think in speaking with the Brightmans and reading some of the pieces that Arthur Brightman in particular has written around the inspiration for Tezos, part of it was a reaction to the fact that protocol upgrades in Bitcoin were so contentious. And we've seen this play out over the last 3 years with the Bitcoin block size wars, which really started in 2015. They were my sort of first introduction. I was starting to work professionally in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And so I got dragged into that world very quickly. That's very informal, very much off-chain governance, super messy, very contentious, because there's a lot at stake here. Bitcoin at the time when this is starting to happen was $300 million network. It is now a $70 billion network. And so decisions that get made can have a real impact. And so I think a lot of people just growing up in the world where it was only Bitcoin, and there was Purecoin and a few others who were starting to experiment with staking and governance mechanisms. But really, it was just Bitcoin. And so a lot of people said, well, all this messiness around Bitcoin, what if we don't just innovate with the consensus mechanism at the protocol level, but what if we also innovate with some of the governance mechanisms and try to look at new ways to organize people and to facilitate decision-making around these systems? So in my view, a lot of these staking protocols or protocols with formal on-chain governance or even informal off-chain governance are experiments that are trying to untangle what types of systems may work best for the ultimate aim people are trying to achieve with these networks.
Interesting. Okay, so then you're saying that some of the on-chain mechanisms are trying to solve the problem with the governance that Bitcoin had, which was leading more towards the tyranny.
A perceived tyranny, right?
Tyranny, yes.
If you're on the Bitcoin core side or the Bitcoin Cash side, you see people forking the code and creating their own communities because they don't agree with the way the community they're part is being governed. And that's the beauty of these protocols. Yeah. If you don't have an amendment process or an upgrade process where you can achieve social consensus, which is really what governance is about, it's about social consensus, then people can just simply take the code, because it's open source software, fork it, and create their own community with its own set of values and its own governance mechanism.
Yeah. Okay. So then they tried to tackle this problem with on-chain governance. And I think in your blog post, you listed 5 projects that currently have well thought out, at least somewhat well thought out, like on-chain governance protocols. Not necessarily
market cap size. So I did it. So I don't think people care about whether or not governance is well designed. People care about money, right? Right now, this is like mostly speculative investing. I'll just be very candid. Most of crypto today is highly experimental, but a lot of speculative investing. So the 5 protocols I looked at, ranked by market cap size, were EOS, NEM, Tezos, Decred, and
Dash.
That's right. And Dash has been around for a long time. People always get angry. What's interesting is in all of these, I looked at the form of consensus and how governance works in these is all very different. So Dash and NEM have a masternode structure, which is different than liquid staking or liquid proof of stake, liquid democracy concept. And then EOS has its own very unique construct with voting for block producers. And then block producers have this off-chain informal governance where they convene and sort of make social consensus decisions. So it's very confusing. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, and like I was looking at the blog post, and it was obvious that each of them has their very unique way of designing and going about on-chain governance. And so to really even do an apples to apples comparison is kind of hard here. But how did you go about looking at this data to try to, or like, what made you look at this data and say, oh no, it's kind of trending towards an oligopoly?
Sure. So as I started thinking about it, the way I kind of approach thinking about the problem set and then the solution design, right? So the problem set is governance of crypto networks is difficult. The design was, let's create new forms of governance, ways of reaching social consensus, or ways of agreeing on the types of changes we'd like to make as a community, which is defined very differently in all these protocols. And then as a part of that design, let's look at the outcomes of these different metrics that are associated with how these protocols were set up. So the first thing I looked at was the risk and the reward of participating in governance in each protocol. And here the challenge is there are two fundamental functions that we kind of mentioned earlier. So in staking systems, staking plays two roles. One, staking secures the network, right? So there are nodes that people create, and these nodes receive an inflationary reward because they secure the network. And then there's a second function, which is participating in formal on-chain governance. And in some systems like Decred, these are separate. So Decred has staking for protocol upgrades, and then it has a separate function called Politeia where people vote on treasury proposals. Tezos is very different. In Tezos, both staking to secure the network and governance are interlinked, and it's the same, that you can't separate the two issues. So the Athens Amendment that was voted on last week, the outcome of it included both a sort of governance function and protocol upgrades. And then in EOS, it's totally different. But the way I looked at it is, what's the amount of risk you have to take? What's the amount of reward you get?
Yeah.
So the data's in there. Then I looked at the number of people or number of token holders participating in governance. So the participation rate varies anywhere from 25% in EOS to above 80% in Tezos. And I had some more data as well around how that compares to participation in real world voting, like the US midterm election, the Brexit vote, as well as recent data I added to another post was data around Estonia's digital voting. And actually what we found is digital voting lowers the rate of participation because people feel that the outcome is less significant if it isn't, if there isn't friction in voting, which is weird. There's like all of these psychological issues with governance as well. And then what I looked at was how many parties control these networks, right? So in EOS, there are these 21 block producers, there are 100 backup block producers, but really decisions are made by those 21. Yeah. And then also there's a fundamental relationship between exchanges who are large holders of tokens or investors who in a lot of cases may own 10, 20, 30, 50% of a protocol, as well as foundations or protocol teams who themselves may own a lot of tokens. So again, just using EOS as an example, in the EOS example, Block 1, which is the entity that created EOS, holds 10% of the tokens, and they're voting with those tokens. They're voting for block producers, right? Whereas in Tezos, the Tezos Foundation still has a large number of the Tezos tokens that are intended to be used as the inflationary reward for the protocol, but they're not participating in on-chain governance, right? So they have a clearer separation of powers. And so again, just looking at how do you actually participate in governance? What's the cost? What's the setup? And what's the risk you're taking with the assets by having them on chain? Differs greatly amongst all of them. Who can actually participate? So do you need to have technical competence, infrastructure setup, et cetera? How do you participate? And then what does that mean in the context of participation rates we're seeing on these networks in these quote unquote governance decisions?
So Okay, so you talked about risks, like you looked at the risk model, how many people are actually involved in the participation. And it looks like you made that claim based on the participation being coming from a very limited set of people. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And is that only true for EOS, or can you make the same claim for like Dash, Neo, Tezos, and Decreed?
Sure. So to go back to that, it goes back to this idea that actually Balaji Srinivasan talked about when they were building EARN several years ago, is the Gini coefficient, right? Yeah. So the Gini coefficient is an economic measure of inequality. But the way I look at it is not the Gini coefficient for income, which is how it's tracked in most economic studies, but the Gini coefficient for asset distribution. So what's interesting here is when a protocol first gets created, especially with ERC20 tokens, all the tokens are mined up front, but even with something like Bitcoin, where, you know, there was this fair mine, which is also a contentious topic, but they're a group of people who inevitably will own a large proportion of the tokens. And so looking at Tezos, which I did an extensive analysis of last summer when they first launched the network, which is an exciting time, 80% of tokens were held by, I think, like 2% of token holders.
Wow.
Right. So there is a really, and I looked at the Gini coefficients of initial asset distribution across a number of protocols, and many of them were, 0.8, 0.9, which means very unequal. So you have a small number of people who hold a lot of the tokens, and then you have a large number of people who hold very small amounts of tokens. And so when it comes to governance, if voting is tied to the number of tokens you own, this is kind of the definition of a plutarchy, right? Where the wealthy have more voting power. And then that's further compounded by the fact that we now see the introduction of aggregators, so exchanges, wallets, these entities that have a large number of coins they're holding on behalf of their customers, or funds and investors who may own, 10, 20% of the tokens in a protocol. They have a really, really outsized influence in the governance decisions that are getting made because they have a massive vested economic interest, but also they own the tokens, and if it's a one token, one vote system, that's how it's going to work.
Yeah. So, okay. So in what you said, what you're basically saying is that a lot of these protocols, the initial distribution is so centralized that on-chain governance by nature is going to be centralized because only a few people own a majority of the tokens.
Yes. And then to further compound that, once the process of staking for governance begins, that effect gets further compounded because as inflationary rewards get issued to people who participate, these larger players who are more incentivized to participate will retain their pro rata share of ownership of those tokens, right? So for example, in Tezos, if I own 20% of all Tezos tokens today,
yeah,
so long as I continue to participate in the network, I will own 20% in perpetuity, even though the total number of Tezos tokens will increase by a factor of 8.
Wow. Okay.
This to reinforce the plutocracy. And I haven't seen, now people are starting to talk about, are there ways that we can dilute people over time? And this is one of the ideas, with Bitcoin, that over time, as people's perceived wealth in Bitcoin and even in Ether went up, we saw that the distribution of assets got wider because people start selling these assets for cash or for other assets they may want to hold.
So then if you were to recommend new projects that are going to experiment with on-chain governance mechanisms, would you say that how the initial assets and tokens are distributed play a huge role in how successful the governance could be?
Yes and no. I think there's an ongoing debate. So we have this conversation around decentralization often in crypto, right? And the question I always like to ask is, but why?
Yeah.
Why, right? For example, if I'm starting a small tech company and I have a really revolutionary idea, I don't want that to be decentralized. I want there to be a very centralized entity that is endowed with a lot of money, that has the resources and the ability to go and execute on the vision, right? And even before this call, you and I were chatting, like Ethereum has kind of had this with Vitalik serving as a benevolent dictator of sorts and really being one of the leading voices, if not, I would argue he's the leading voice in the community. He's tried to take a step back, and arguably I think it's created some strife and discord within the Ethereum community because there's now kind of a void of leadership. And so this is where, this argument is it better initially? These projects are experiments. The jury's still out as to whether or not on-chain formal governance is actually an effective mechanism. And the metrics you use, depending on what your goals are, could be very different. So in an investor's eyes, it could be success. In a user's eyes, it could not be a success. I mean, the problem is it's so subjective to gauge whether or not things work or whether or not things are successful. But I would argue that, if you have an idea that you're working on and it would benefit from more centralization, then maybe not having a lot of participants involved initially is a good thing. But I do think you need to be cognizant, again, of the design space you're working in and what the end objectives are. And if one of the end objectives is to have quote unquote fairness, which is a very esoteric concept, or to have wide distribution, that's one of the things you need to think about very early on in terms of how you initially distribute assets and the incentives over time that will dilute the ownership of really large holders.
Yeah, and you make a really good point here, and this is something that for example, with TruStory, we chose to go with the more centralized approach in the sense that we have a leader, we have a team.
Are you a dictator?
Yes, I'm the dictator. And honestly,
you are a nice dictator.
Honestly, I think this was 100% the right choice because it helps us actually define a vision, execute on the vision, and ship something rather than trying to build something that, like, in the end, like, unless you're a blockchain, I don't really see a complete reason yet why an app should be completely decentralized. And so
I don't either. And I don't think decentralization means nothing in and of itself. It's a means to an end, right?
Exactly. What is the goal you're trying to achieve with decentralization? And I think people go too far with trying to make things decentralized for the sake of decentralization. And I think some of it also falls on the community too, because there's almost a shaming done, like if you're too centralized. And so some of these protocol developers feel a pressure to need to decentralize without really understanding why.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that goes back to what are you trying to do here? And one of the interesting questions to me, just looking at, so there was recently some great research published around participation rates in the recent Aragon proposals. Aragon is actually a second layer protocol that can be used by other protocols that don't have a governance mechanism to do governance. And where that comes from, if you'll recall, back in the days of the DAO, the original Ethereum Dao, when the DAO got hacked, there was a conversation around, having a hard fork in Ethereum, and a coin vote was conducted. And there's a great blog post written by Peter Todd that I reference in my blog post about why a coin vote's necessary. And since coin vote was conducted, nobody knew how to participate in it. I think 5% of all Ether token holders participated, and that 5% participation rate represented like 200 wallets, a very small number of wallets, right? And so I think a lot of people looked at that and they were like, wait a minute, we need a better way of polling the community for sentiment. And this actually goes back to, again, I draw a lot of inspiration from history because I think cycles sort of rhyme. They don't, but they rhyme. And we have this new technology medium that we're trying to use to resolve a problem that's millennia old, right? It's basically as old as humans are and social structures are. It's a really old problem, and we have this new tool, and so we're trying to figure out, can this tool help us design around this problem in a new way? And what I think is really lacking is the dialogue, right? So back in the days of the Romans, whenever there was a big decision that was being made or a contentious issue, people would go to the forum, and there were people who were professional orators or speakers, and they would debate. Right? This is why I love these debates you're doing. People would have conversations. I was on the high school debate team, loved it.
Oh, wow, amazing.
I was a nerd, so it was a loser, I think is better.
I actually used to hate debate when I was in high school because I thought debate was intimidating. But I've actually grown to absolutely love debate because debate is an incredible way to learn and truly learn a topic. Because like when you're arguing a side, you have to think about all sides of the claim and what you're really trying to put out there. But anyways, I digress. Go ahead.
No. It's very true. But this was the way, and this is one of Polybius's observations, as he was writing his treatise on social organization and politics and the structure of human society. One of his observations is people are not going to know what good governance is unless they're educated about it. And the only way for people to be educated is to participate in and observe these debates, right? Where people whose professional job function it is to gather data and to research and to understand these issues and become experts in these matters, where they debate. That's what the people who represent us in America are supposed to do. Now, whether or not they do that effectively, I have many, many doubts, but that's a separate topic. But so the idea is, since each protocol is so different, since each network is so different, since each community around these protocols is so different, what we need is forums where people can look at the data, where people can understand both sides or the many sides of a particular issue and make informed decisions about governance. Now, in reality, like I personally participate in probably 6 different protocols that deploy staking of some sort. I already spend a lot of time on crypto stuff. It's like impossible to keep up with. Yeah. And I have a job and I have side projects. And so keeping up with all the nuances and intricacies of what's going on in all these staking protocols is a lot of work. And most people just don't have the appetite to do that. And so to me, designing a voting mechanism or a governance mechanism without thinking about how information, data, and data dissemination is going to happen is kind of, it's an incomplete experiment, right? Because people are making decisions in a vacuum.
Yep, exactly.
And so it loses all context. And so to me, one of the core things to think about is, okay, if we are going to have on-chain governance as an experiment, how do we actually better A/B test the quality of the conversation happening in these different networks and the level of engagement in those conversations? Like, if you aren't on Twitter, crypto Twitter, you're not going to know even that a vote is happening or that you're supposed to do something with your tokens. So
yeah, and it gets into the whole. I know exactly what thread you're talking about with the Argon, and they were saying how the participation rates were like pretty negligible, like in the 1-digit percentages or something. And I think there's a lot of reasons that go into that. One is like the UX for it is really complicated today. Like you kind of have to be pretty technical to even be able to go in and vote in any of these protocols. Two, an interesting point that someone made in that thread was that like what is an incentive? What is the incentive for someone to come in and vote? Like people don't want to govern for the sake of governing, right? Like most humans just want to live and let other people make decisions for them, and that's why we have a representative democracy. Like people don't want to always be voting. Sure. So it's like the question even goes deeper than like UX. It's like what is the incentive for these people to even participate?
Well, and I think what you're expressing is the question I come back to with all things in crypto, which is, but why?
Exactly.
So we can create this great voting tool, and we can create these tokens and these 2 token systems, or one's a voting token and one's a judiciary token, which Aragon is doing, but why, right? And I think at the end of the day, one of the things I even struggle with is, so you're working on TruStory, right? You know everything that's going on in the company. To you, this is like the most important, most significant thing. But to the outsider, I know very little about TruStory. I don't ever think about TruStory unless I'm reading something you've written or reading or engaging with you. And so I think people forget context, to your point. Yeah. Look at the engagement rate. Look at civic engagement in this country. Look at civic engagement around the world. And again, I go back to the example of Estonia. Estonia introduced digital voting. Like people just don't care. I have a mortgage. I have kids. I'm in school. I'm working a job. I'm trying to figure out how to live. I have a lot of stuff going on, voting on issues that to me feel arbitrary, like for example, what the gas limit should be. I don't care. And so I think a lot of times we kind of lose that larger macro context, which is where one of the things, the whole inspiration for this blog post I wrote was a talk I gave at Aragon Con about crypto cartels. And I actually don't think that having centralization and governance is a bad thing.
Exactly. I'm on the same page.
People who are experts, right?
Exactly.
I am perfectly happy to let someone who is an expert in, I don't know, Decred make decisions on my behalf because
Exactly.
I don't know. And if that person holds a large number of tokens, they're going to be financially motivated to do what's in the best interest of all token holders.
Exactly.
That's the premise, right?
Yeah. And like, this kind of goes into, there's a really good blog post of Hasib wrote where he talks about like your end users don't really know what they want. Like it's your job as the expert to kind of help design these protocols. So why are you delegating those decisions out to the end users who have the least context, like you just said?
And that goes back to, right, that goes back to this idea of path dependency and Schelling points, right? Is what really, in my view, governance does is it's a problem that people have tried to solve for a long time. And this is a problem of optimums, right? And so there's a lot of research that's been done around political science and governance systems in the real world, not in crypto world. And one of the findings actually was that the system that leads to sort of Pareto optimality for the populace as a whole, not for individuals, is actually benevolent dictatorship, which is really
interesting. Can you go into that?
Sure. So what's interesting here is so each individual has their own preferences, right? So you have your own optimal governance structure. I have my own optimal governance structure because we're all unique individuals with preferences, experiences, insights, expertise, et cetera, in different areas. However, if you take 300 million people who are part of the United States of America, or if you take, say, for example, in the Tezos protocol, I know that one best, so I'll reference that one, the initial the token fundraiser, 32,000 people participated. So you can consider the size of that population to be 32,000, although arguably it's probably grown over time. There really isn't a great way to track all of the individual token holders, but the number of wallet addresses is probably a good indicator, right? So say you have a population of 1 million users in your crypto network, right? 1 million holders of your token, because in this case, user is equal to token holder, which is also kind of an imperfect relationship, but it is what it is. So we have 1 million users in our digital state, if you will, right? Let's call it a digital state or a network. Each of those has individual preferences, but collectively, the type of governance structure that makes them happiest or is best for them is often not a pure democracy. It's often either representative democracy or benevolent dictatorship.
Oh my God, that's so fascinating. I didn't realize, I didn't know about the benevolent dictatorship being a optimal governance. I'll have to read more about that.
I'll find the academic paper where it was said, and I only learned this through a debate with someone at Crypto Springs, which you were at as well.
Yeah.
This woman, Angel, who comes from the world of government and NGOs, she and I were having a conversation. We were talking about governance, and she was like, well, actually, this is what I do for a living. That was her expertise, certainly not my expertise. Yeah. And so she was just giving me a lot of great data points around a lot of the research that's been done. And again, I think you have to go back to, a lot of the things we're doing in crypto are attempting to resolve problems that have been persisted throughout human history, and we're attempting to resolve them in new ways. So in order to understand how to design an effective experiment, we have to go back to what's been done in the past and what the outcomes of those experiments have been. Otherwise, I sometimes worry that we're simply innovating for the sake of innovation. Yeah. And I think we sometimes see that, right? We're seeing that now with some of these governance protocols. Like, okay, great, we have this thing, but what do we do now?
Why? Yeah.
Why?
Like, I think a lot of projects today are doing, like, they do stuff, but they don't really think about why and what is really the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think even for example, not just in governance, but like DeFi. Yeah. I think like we're reinventing a lot of.
Hold on, DopeFi now is what I heard.
What is it?
DopeFi. They don't say DeFi, they say DopeFi.
Okay, wow. Okay, I'm way behind times then. I think like we're reinventing a lot of stuff that's already been done, but not really thinking about why or what problem we're really trying to tackle here. And I think I don't know if that's just the nature of the fact that we're so early and it's so developer oriented, and so developers love to tinker, and so they're just tinkering with this new technology. Like I don't know what it is, but like people aren't really thinking about problems in a big way, and I don't know why.
Well, I think it's exactly what you articulated. I think one component of it is there is this premise that blockchains will eat the world, right? So Mark Andreessen's like famous for saying software will eat the world.
Yeah.
And so there's now this new thing people are saying, blockchains will eat the world. And I actually think there's a very real probability that blockchains won't eat the world, not in their iteration today, one. And I think two is I am also not convinced that some of the designs we're seeing today are ultimately the designs that are going to be optimal for the largest number of people, right? So if we think about this from an adoption perspective, yes, there's still a lot of work to be done to build out the application layer. And in fact, I just published something on Medium. I hosted a staking summit early last week, where we brought together some of the different players in the staking space, whether it's large investors, exchanges, staking as a service companies, data companies, prediction market companies. And a lot of the conversation was sort of around how this ecosystem is evolving. And one of the things we talked about is like, oh, we need applications that'll abstract out the complexity of how you participate in governance in all of these different protocols. And that'll go a long way in resolving some of the challenges. And I'm like, okay, great. So we can create an abstraction layer, and it can literally be like going to a poll and picking on issues, but it doesn't resolve the fundamental question of, okay, we can have tools, we can have applications, we can have these networks, but what are people going to use them for? And this is kind of the phase we're at. You know, you could call it the crossing the chasm phase or the trough of disillusionment, depending on what sort of management consulting theory you prescribe to. But at the end of the day, I feel like we're sort of at this existential crossroads where we're asking, but why? And like, there are a lot of problems people are solving that, yes, they're intellectually interesting, but in a way it feels like intellectual masturbation.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I worry that we're sitting in an echo chamber and we're forgetting, like, we're a small group of people and we're thinking about problems that impact 7 billion people who live on this planet today, 9 billion people who will live on this planet 30 years from now. There are really, really big problems that need to be solved that I don't really think blockchains are the only part of the solution. It requires working across different domains. It requires incorporating ethics, behavioral economics, you know, a variety of different fields. You know, we've seen a lot of publications recently on the inherent discrimination in AI and even in product design. So I think there are just like much greater societal problems that we should be thinking about. So that's been one of the personal struggles, I guess, I have. It's a long and rambly sort of way to say I sometimes struggle with this lack of, well, why?
Why? Yeah.
It's
And it's a really good question. And I think like it's not well accepted. Like if you try to question some of these, some of the crypto, like really deep crypto folks like almost get offended. And I think it's not meant to offend, but it's meant to just like, I think we're at a phase where we have this technology and we're trying to find a use case.
Yeah.
And everyone on the outside is looking in and be like, so what is this useful exactly? Like my boyfriend, for example, he's not in crypto, but when I talk to him about the crypto world, he's like, that sounds like a cult. And I'm like, it kind of is, you know, like.
What's so funny is my husband works at an actual cult. He works at Barstool Sports, which is a cult for all intents and purposes. Their followers are insane. They're a media company. So we have these shirts. He has one that says Barstool versus the world, and I have one that says Bitcoin versus the world. So we have our own cults that we follow. But I do think, look, I think people get offended because people are spending a lot of time and energy. They're super passionate about what they're doing. And I think people have come up with really innovative and interesting things. And I think sometimes when you ask people questions, they construe it as ad hominem attacks. I've certainly had this problem. I tend to be an extremely direct person. I was raised in the Netherlands. Like, they're very direct in Holland. As I tend to be very direct, I have never felt an emotion that I have not verbalized or expressed.
Yeah.
That's part of my culture. Like, I'm Turkish and Dutch. That's what we do. We just talk about our feelings. We say what we want to say. And I think for someone who's really deep in this, to your point, they think about this 24/7. It can feel like an attack. But I worry sometimes that without critical thinking and without healthy discourse and debate, we're living inside of an echo chamber. And what we've seen during this bear market is, instead of going out into the world and, addressing some of these fundamental existential questions about crypto and blockchain networks, instead our communities becoming more insular and withdrawing more into these echo chambers because we want to reject all information that does not conform to our worldview. And that's so damaging.
It's actually, yeah, it's really bad. And I'm honestly super passionate about this problem because, like, I've noticed that, like, people make claims on the internet, and every time I will DM them privately and be like, hey, like, would you be open to talking about this? And then they don't feel comfortable talking about it because either A, they realize that, like, their claim is unsubstantiated, but the bigger problem is they're actually scared. They're scared to put out controversial views out there. I'm having a hard time getting this industry out of this mindset of being right and wrong, or plugging into a narrative. And if it doesn't fit into a narrative, then you don't want to talk about it. I just think, like, yeah, I'm 100% on the same page. We lack the ability to have a healthy conversation and even talk about the most controversial views. Like, for example, I noticed in the beginning of this conversation, you were a little bit nervous to even say that Bitcoin is perceived as a tyranny. And I don't think you should feel that way. I think you should be totally comfortable saying that.
Well, I've had an interesting 5 years in the Bitcoin community, and just going through the scaling sort of situation, having been, part of the goings on of the New York agreement, which was just very messy in so many different ways and not relevant to this conversation. But I think I have become very sensitive to all of these different factions. But I think part of it's also, if you think about what we're doing here, one of the interesting things is, we're seeing kind of the fall of interest in religion and the rise of interest in science and truth and reason, right? So we're going through this shift. But in that process, what we're seeing is the increasing sort of fragmentation into self-selected communities that perpetuate and substantiate our worldview. Yeah. And what that's leading to is, I think, just a interesting lack of ability to have discourse. And this has been debated widely with, the use of Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms. But one of the reasons why I think crypto feels so contentious is because this is, in a way, its own religion. It's a cult, as you said. And so when you start to question some of the core beliefs of some of these communities, to a lot of people, it feels like an attack. And that's where, to me, the governance piece gets really interesting, because staking is going to be $1 billion industry by the end of this year. There will be $1 billion of network rewards that are paid out this year.
Wow. And really?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Wow.
So $1 billion of network rewards. And the data for that, by the way, is in this post I just published, which is a summary of the staking summit we hosted. And in there is also a little ecosystem map that maps out some of the key players that are emerging, and then all the different ecosystem participants and how they participate in these governance and staking systems. But there's a lot at stake here. And to your point, there is a reason that people want to control the narrative, and the reason why is there's money to be made here. Yep. And so controlling the narrative is about controlling the flow of money. It's about controlling attention, which is arguably the scarcer resource because money feels infinite in crypto. And really what's scarce is talent, execution capability, and attention. And so all of these protocols are vying for attention, right?
Yeah. And I think this is my, like, if I'm on one mission with TruStory and just, like, in general in the crypto world, it's to, like, open up people and have conversations, because, like, and that's why I've kind of been a little bit more open on Twitter lately as well. Like, I think people are so scared to be wrong or fall into the wrong narrative, and you're right. Like, it's for the first time there's so much money tied to this system that, like, the bag holders are, like anytime you say something, it's like it feels like a personal attack against you.
Oh yeah. And every time I say something, there's like, first it was the Ripple army, but now all these other coins I've never heard of have their own like armies who will, everything I write, they're like, have you heard of da da da? Like for a while it was token pay, which I don't know what that is. And look, at the end of the day, here's what it comes down to. We have created a medium for permissionless financial innovation. And so having created that medium, I think it is silly that people are trying to play like the ethical or moral police for the industry. If someone wants to create BitConnect and someone wants to buy it and there is a market for BitConnect, that is free market economics at work. Now, I personally do not prescribe to that. I personally take issue with some of the ways things are being done, and I have repeatedly expressed my view on these things. I think I have tried to be exceedingly open and transparent about my own process of learning, because we're all figuring this out. There is like no right answer. Nobody's an expert on everything. We're all figuring this out as we go. And we may design something with one intention. Look at the DAO, right? We designed it with one intention, but what ended up happening was totally unexpected. It was very bad for the Ethereum community. It led to sort of this turning point, but we're designing these things, we're deploying them live and sort of putting them out there and seeing what happens. And I think the biggest question I always ask is, okay, what is the hypothesis we're trying to prove, right? So as a mathematician and someone who always liked science, you start with a hypothesis, right? And then you figure out, how do I design an experiment that's going to confirm or reject that hypothesis? And what are the data points I'll gather? And so that's where I think the challenge comes in for people, is it's easy for me to, you know, get on stage or like crypto event or hang out with people and make all these claims and say all these things. But then if I look at if I ask you, what's the hypothesis you're trying to prove? And what is the data you have that substantiates or refutes this hypothesis? And if it's refuted, how do you design a better experiment or change the design parameters to attempt to confirm that hypothesis? They kind of look at me like I'm a crazy person. And they're like, oh, well, like, you don't get it, like decentralized. I'm like, maybe I don't get it. Maybe I really don't. But I do think that for this, like for crypto for people to trust what's happening here, for people to believe in these things, there has to be evidence. Like Copernicus was trying to prove that the planets revolved around the sun, that the earth revolved around the sun. That was like the most heretical idea ever. Many people were killed and hanged and like burned at the stake for trying to articulate a fact. But for the first time, he was able to use data and positively demonstrate that this was in fact what was happening. And so again, I kind of feel the same way sometimes. Like, we need more heretics who are willing to say these unpleasant truths and use fact. And it's not to say that these experiments are worthless. It's just, let's design better experiments and be more transparent about what we're learning. Because I don't think we do a good job at that. And governance is the place where it's the hardest, because no one's publishing data about anything.
Yeah, I agree. So like, if you had to give, so basically one thing I would recommend people take away from this is like, everything in crypto is an experiment. If anyone tells you otherwise, I think they're lying to you. Secondly, Meltem, like, if you had to give someone advice in terms of how they should go about either designing on-chain governance or any kind of protocol, like, what would you tell them?
I think the biggest thing I would ask is, but why?
But why? Yep.
Why do we need this? Look at all of the things that exist today, both in the crypto world and, by the way, outside the crypto world. Like, a lot of things can just be done with databases, and just because you're using applied cryptography doesn't mean you're a blockchain. But why? Why is this needed? Why is this necessary? What is missing in the world today that this will solve for? One. And then two, as you think about sort of how you're articulating the value proposition, or sort of how we might be able to track whether or not your view of the world is one that makes sense, is, well, what hypothesis or what hypotheses are you going to test, and in what order, and how do you effectively prioritize, right? So I think people sometimes forget that one, design is iterative, but it's also there's path dependence that's created when you make one decision early on that sort of sets the stage for everything that happens subsequently. And so I think for a lot of people, I just have a lot of questions around sequencing, when they're going to run what experiments, how they're thinking about deploying things, because there is this idea in crypto land that everything's changeable. And I don't think that's true, because you get lock-in effect. And again, as we've seen through a lot of these governance challenges, once people get accustomed to a certain way, you get entrenched interest. It's inevitable. It's human nature. This is how we operate. And then the last thing I kind of always like to say is blockchains don't change human nature. So never forget that humans are greedy, self-interested, vain, envious, lazy, myself included. And that's not a negative comment. It's not to say people are inherently bad. I just think, again, people have very different priorities, and typically people's priorities are fairly focused on their peripheral world, where they are the center, they are the sun, right? I'm the center of my own solar system. And inside of everyone's brain, there is a view of the world that is very different from yours, where they are at the center. And I think sometimes people forget that when they're talking to someone. So like, why should I care about what you're doing?
Yeah.
Through my
I agree. I think like in the end of the day, we are so obsessed with this technology, but the technology needs to operate with humans. If you don't understand humans, then you're left with just technology. And so I think I 100% agree that like, especially if you're designing governance protocols, like you really have to understand humans, human behavior, how historical governance structures have existed, what's been tried, what's been failed. Because there's so many lessons to be learned from history that it'd be a shame to just try to invent something when you could have saved probably years of time or even decades of time just learning from history. But we're reaching almost an hour, so I'm going to cut the session off now. But thank you for joining. And for anyone who has comments and questions, there was a bunch of really good questions in the Periscope. We'll follow up with answers in the Twitter thread, so just ask us questions there.
Yeah, and thanks, Preethi. I love these debates, so keep them going. And then if anyone's interested in governance, working on projects around governance or staking, I did publish something on Medium today about the staking summit, but one of the things we're doing is kind of creating an ecosystem map of all the different protocols and players in this developing, growing space. So if you're working on something here, please add your name, contact info. We'll have a mailing list of sorts soon, so we'll let you opt into that. And then we are trying to create kind of a repository and easily accessible place so people can connect, talk to one another, share more, but also so investors can learn about your company, find you, and journalists who are looking to talk to people can get a broader view. So highly encourage people to communicate, collaborate, and my DMs are always open. So happy to chat.
Thanks, Meltem.
Bye, guys.
Bye.